And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have Sarah Hawley on the show with me today. I know that a lot of you are torn because, Sarah, just to give you a little heads up, we're having
Uh-huh.
daily writing sprints on our channel,
Ooh.
and they're at 12:30 Eastern every day. And this kind of bumped up into the second half of our writing sprint. So
Uh-oh.
I know a lot of folks are torn. Should I finish the sprint?
Should
Should I come over? And
or
so
what?
anyway, Sarah is the author of a brand new book called Servant of Earth. It's the first book in the Shards of Magic. I'm assuming this is going to be a lengthy series. This
It's
is
gonna
the
be three
first book in
books.
3 books.
Yeah.
Awesome,
Yes.
awesome. The what day did it go on sale?
It went out this last Tuesday on the
Okay,
12th, so we are still
okay,
in the first week, which
in
is
the
obviously
first
a,
week.
a very stressful time for authors.
Of course it is. Of course. Sarah, this is your first romantasy book, but
Yes.
you have published three previous in
Yeah.
paranormal romance sort of
Yes. Yeah, I
kind
wrote
of
three paranormal rom-coms, and now this
okay,
is me branching out into like dark fantasy. So it's a very big tonal shift.
very big tonal shift.
Yes.
And I want to talk all about
Mhm.
this is fascinating to me, but Um, we were chatting just before we went live, and I was telling Sarah about all of the NaNoWriMo content that we're creating this month. And Sarah, you were a NaNoWriMo participant,
I
weren't you?
was.
Yeah.
Yes,
What?
I did it multiple years. I
Okay.
didn't win every year, but like I did a few years. I
Yeah.
actually did it.
What did NaNoWriMo teach you? I know for me, the first novel that I wrote 11 years ago was a nano novel,
Mhm.
and there was something about knowing that I could finish, and
Mhm.
and not even necessarily the 50,000 words in 1 month, which is a huge motivator. Don't get me wrong, but just knowing that I could get from beginning to middle to end and write the end at the end of it was
Mhm.
transformative for
Huge.
me. Just knowing, I've talked to so many people, and I think if you were stuck on an elevator with 100 people, first it'd be a terrible experience. But if you were to poll them, how many of you think that you have a book inside you? I think the vast, vast majority would raise their hand. And then, if you started then asking, well, how many have you started on a book? Then maybe half the hands, and then how many have you actually finished a book? And I think it's a very, very small accomplishment for something that so many people think that they want to do. And I think Nano for me was proving to me that I could do it. What about you? What did you learn from the Nano process?
I mean, it was definitely finishing, how to finish something, but I think the most important part for me was getting rid of the self-editing portion that was
Mm,
wasting so much of my time. Because
right,
I was the type where I was trying to write and I would write a chapter and then before I wrote the next chapter, I would go back to the first chapter and then edit it. And then I never got to the second chapter because I was expecting perfection.
right,
And I think that's the perpetual battle with authors is that
yeah,
we want to be perfect right out of the gate and you aren't because a book takes shape in edits. At least for me, it's
right,
like you just have to get it out. You have to get the first thing out and then carve it into a better shape. And so Nano, there was no way for me to hit that 50,000 word limit if I was doing the rigorous self-editing that had caused me to have like here's three really amazing chapters and we never got to the rest of the book. And I think that was an incredible skill to learn, and it's one of the more valuable skills in terms of being a published author now, is the ability to say, you know what, this first draft feels like garbage, and that's okay. It's just
right,
it's a draft. It's a
yeah.
draft, and that is the most important part.
I had someone on the show with someone on the show a couple of weeks ago, and she said, "Have you ever watched a sculptor at work?" And
Mm.
in that first pass, they kind of knock off all the pieces that don't look like a head, or whatever, and it kind of looks like a head, and then each
Yeah.
subsequent pass, the features take shape, and it goes from an amorphous blob to starting to look like a person, and then to a
Mm-hmm.
specific person, and then, you know, down to the point that you can see the expression on their face and emotion starts to come out. But it's all with subsequent passes. And
Yes.
the same thing with writing a novel, that you, so many times we want that first draft to be perfect, and it's just not. That's not its job.
Yeah, that's not its job.
Yeah.
Its job is to be the starting point. And I know like the
Yeah.
blank page is technically the starting point, but letting go of the expectation that you're going to come out with a fully formed sculpture that looks the way that you could just put it on a shelf and it would be perfect. That doesn't happen for anyone that I know, at least. Like maybe there's a
Yeah.
writer out there that just does a first draft and boom, it's amazing, it's perfect, and then they give them $1 million. But no, I think the vast majority of us write the sort of awful first draft, or you recognize like your writer tells you're like, oh, I'm doing that thing again, but it's just, you know what, we're just going to do that thing and I can go back in later and fix it. So like my characters are always like looking at things, they're always looking at things, and they're always like breathing a lot.
Mm.
And it's just a thing, and I'll look on a page and I'm like, oh, we're taking deep breaths, like, oh, his eyes are going this way and his eyes are going this way and his eyes are going this way. And it's like, oh, and I'll be rereading. I'm like, oh, he just looked at so many things in that paragraph. But that is just a thing that I do as a writer in my first drafts, and I can fix that later. He can stop looking at things.
Right, right. Well, you know, we hear, you know, show don't tell. So, you
Hmm.
know, that's kind of one of those cardinal rules that you get taught early
Yeah.
in your writing career. And so you think, well, I need to show emotion here, and, you know, maybe I can do that by him, the way he looks over here, or, you know, that
Yes.
he's sighing, and then you realize that,
Yes.
you know, I just would have been better off to just say that he did that in this point. It's the, you know,
Yes.
it's one of those things. There are cardinal rules, and those things are meant to be broken sometimes. But that's
Hmm.
all just part of working it
Yeah.
out, you know,
Yeah. Or
working
you
the
figure out
skill.
how to write with other senses. I'm a very visual
Right.
person, so I like
Yeah.
to imagine everything. And so a lot of times the emotion is like I'm imagining someone looking around.
Yeah.
Or I'm imagining like, and so you start thinking about like, what does the emotion feel like? What are the sounds? What are the other elements that you bring in to sort of create a more full sensory experience?
Right.
But that doesn't happen in my first draft. My first draft, we are just going to describe what things look like, and everyone's going to like stare at things, and then we'll
Right.
fix it later.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's okay. Just acknowledge this is a thing I do, and then you can file that away. And that's what
Hmm.
second, third, fourth drafts are for. Um, Sarah, I love, love, love to explore a person's uh, oftentimes circuitous route to becoming a
Oh,
writer.
this is a great
Because,
question for me, by the way, because I did
oh,
this very weirdly.
well, and that's what I was getting to. You um, have an MA in archaeology, and you have
Yes.
excavated at an Inca site in Chile, a Bronze Age palace in Turkey, a medieval abbey in England. That's exactly what I would expect a paranormal rom-com author and romance. That's exactly
That's
the path
exactly
that
the
I would have
career
picked
path.
for you. That's I mean, who would have even thought anything else?
Yeah,
Like
no, that's the way.
first first off, what drew you to archaeology?
Yeah, I've always loved history. And I had like a paleontology Barbie when I was a kid, and I was obsessed with ancient Egypt, as we all are.
Of
I didn't
course.
really think it was a career path, and so I actually went to college. I went in as a theater major, and
Okay.
then after the first year, I was like, I'm not feeling this, and I want to do something else. But what combines? I don't know. There's an element of adventure. So there's a ton of theater kids in
Sure.
archaeology, actually. If you end
Really?
up yeah, because it's people who have it's like one foot in the hard sciences and then one foot in the humanities and the arts.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of like reconstruct. It's telling stories. Archaeology is
Okay.
telling stories.
Right.
Like you read these news articles and they say, well, we uncovered this thing and it was clearly like a ritual site for a mother goddess or something. That's all made up.
Mm,
That is someone looking at what is in the ground and then constructing a narrative that seems to fit all the different pieces in the ground. And then you combine that with people doing scholarship in other areas at other sites and what the story they told. And you sort of come up with a collective story about what was probably going on at this part of life. Um, so my cat's right here. Very beautiful. And it comes with drawbacks because enough people telling the same story based, I mean, everyone's telling a story based on their own biases and their own views and the way
Sure.
they view things and the framework with which they understand the world. And so you end up with these trends where like maybe the trend is every single thing is ancestor worship for like 10 years. Every single article is like it must be ancestor worship. And then it's like, well, maybe it's not. And maybe we're all just telling this story because it's the
Right.
story that's already being told by other people. So actually, I do think archaeology actually has a lot to do with writing, not just because we do a lot of writing, we write a lot of
Mhm.
articles, but because it is looking at little pieces and then constructing a narrative. And then you get the theater kids in there because they're like, I want to do something, but I also want to, wear a nice hat.
Mhm.
And have a whip, and then you find out the hats are not nice, and you look like a massive dork in the field. But I want to be an adventure person. I want to be an
Yeah.
adventure scientist.
Yeah, and people
So,
are like, "Why would you bring a whip to a dig? This is very bizarre." Yeah.
yeah. And so like I was on excavation in Turkey and someone I don't remember which musical, someone started singing a show tune and then everyone chimed in. And that was when we all realized we were musical theater kids.
That's so funny. That is so funny. So how long did you work, in archaeology?
Yeah, ultimately longer than many, but not very long because it's a very difficult field to stay employed in. So I got my master's, and then I worked for a couple of years as a lab manager at an archaeology lab, and then as a
Okay.
researcher at a museum. And the researcher at a museum was amazing. I was like, I've made it. Like this is what I want to do, and then they laid us all off. So at that point, I transitioned to other things. So I've lived all these different career lifestyles. Like after that, I went
Yeah,
into marketing. Went into
as
marketing,
one does.
as one does. I was just like, I
Mhm.
just need to pay rent.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing. Like, what can I pay rent? And someone told me about an internship. So here we are. And then admin and library and kind of all over the place. But the
Sure.
writing was a through line. I was always writing in my spare time.
Well, that was gonna be my next question, like,
Yeah.
were you a bookish kid? Where and
Yes.
did you, what kinds of stories really captured your imagination?
Yeah. I was always a bookish kid and I was sci-fi fantasy all the way because
Okay.
my mother was a sci-fi fantasy fan and she had this massive collection and it was like Tolkien, it was Andre Norton and Ray Bradbury and Douglas Adams and Roger Zelazny and just all the classics
Oh,
and I
yeah.
just read those all obsessively as a kid. So I was constantly reading. I would read while I was walking. I would read while I was roller skating, which was not super safe, but like my parents I think have photos of me like just like skating around the driveway with my head in a book. I could never stop. And I always kind of wanted to be a writer, and I was always writing little things for myself. Like the first time I
Yeah.
tried to like write a book was about first grade.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, it wasn't great, but it was interesting.
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
Yeah, so I was just always doing this in my spare time, and then sometime I think in grad school, I decided I wanted to really make a serious go of it and make writing a daily habit as much as I could.
Yeah.
And then from there, you make writing a daily habit for as long as you can, and then at some point, you're like, I'm ready to take the step of querying and going that route.
Yeah. When did you discover NaNoWriMo, and how did that become part of your, I'm and was this when you were, attempting to write a novel to sell, or was this just part of your hobby?
It was part of the hobby. So I discovered NaNoWriMo in college, and I did
Okay.
write a book in college, but it was like 90 pages. It was not actually a book. It was a
Yeah.
novella. I just didn't have the word for that at the time. And so I was doing it as I wasn't ready to try and get published yet. I just wanted to finish books. So I discovered it in college and then did it for a few years. And now I don't do nano anymore just because I'm constantly on different writing deadlines. So like every month
Sure.
is my nano month. But
Right.
it was really helpful those first few years to get me kickstarted in writing as a habit.
Yeah. Your new book is Romantasy, which is definitely having a moment right now,
It
this whole
is.
genre. But previously you published 3 paranormal rom-coms,
Hmm.
which is another subgenre that's kinda having a moment, right
Yes.
now. From a sci-fi fantasy, kid, to being a professional author who's kind of found some niches that you are, really excelling at. What drew you first off to the paranormal rom-com? How did you kind of
Yeah.
discover that niche in writing, and how did you realize that this was going to be something that you had a voice for?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because talking about circuitous routes towards
Yeah.
publishing, this book, Servant of Earth, was the first book I queried and got an agent with in 2017. And I was querying it as fantasy. I feel like romantasy is the big buzzword for now. Like it
Right.
is a fantasy with a romantic subplot, but it's fantasy
Of
first and
course.
foremost.
Yeah.
So I queried it, I got an agent, I went on submission, and then the book died on submission. And a lot of
Mm.
it was like it's not the right marketplace, it's not the right time. The Fae aren't in what they're calling new adult, which is sort of college-ish aged protagonist. They're like, we're
Mhm.
not sure about that. So it died, and then I wrote another book that also died on submission, and these were all darker fantasies. But I also loved reading romance as well. I started reading romance in college, and I think it's just such a wonderful genre.
Yeah.
And then also concurrently with this, while my books were dying on submission, I started writing fan fiction because it was just an exercise in recovering the joy of writing and some of the
Mhm.
validation of being part of a community, writing something and then immediate and putting it out there and people just read it immediately versus all of the waiting of being on submission. So I was
Right.
experimenting with the comedic tone in the fan fiction and then decided I'm going to write a fantasy romance, but I'm going to do it with the rom-com tone. And then I just happened to get in right when witchy rom-coms were having a moment, which like you
Yeah.
can't write to a trend because the trend comes
Especially in
back around.
traditional published
Yeah.
especially in traditional publishing where the machine tends to move very
Yeah.
slowly, and
Yeah.
by the time you, find a trend, by the time your book gets there, it's long
Yeah.
gone. Yeah,
Because all the books on shelves were bought by editors like 1 to 2 years ago. So
exactly.
if you're seeing a trend, it was a trend that they were buying 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I lucked into witchy rom-coms being a trend. And then the Fae trend came back around and they said, well, you have this book that's basically ready. Let's try and get it into the schedule. So that's how it happened, was entirely market driven for why the story came back.
So so let m um, so, some people will tell you to identify trends and then try
Mhm.
to, capitalize on those trends, and we know that especially in traditional publishing, that's that is a difficult thing to do because the way that how fast the machine moves and all of that. What can you do? Like, if you have determined, like, these are books that I love, how do you
Mhm.
tell that there's going to be a market? And, because you're investing probably
Yeah.
6 months of your life, into developing this idea and then getting it out there. Are there any things that you identified, for your process that helped you to at least know you were working in the right direction, even if you weren't targeting a specific thing? Like, I think that confuses a lot of people, like, well, how do I even know what to invest my time in?
Yeah. I think this is the hard answer. And I remember when I was an aspiring author and getting out, I'm like, well, how will I know what the trends are? Because ultimately what I wanted was to be published. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, well, if I want to be published, I have to publish something that publishers want to publish.
Mhm.
I think the sad thing is that you can't write a concept to a trend. You have to write something that you care about enough to spend 6 months on it and then read it over and over again. And once you get it published, you're going to do multiple rounds of edits. And like you have to love this book so much that by the time we're all sick of it before publication, it's you're still okay with it.
Right.
The one thing I do think everyone needs to do that no one wants to do is pay attention to publishing genre norms and especially for word count. I cannot tell you how many friends of mine want to write a fantasy book and they want to query it, and their fantasy book is 200,000 words or it's 250,000 words. And I say you need to get that down as close to 100,000 as you can for a debut author, at the very least under 150,000. And they say, I don't want to because the story cannot function with less than 200,000 words. Like then you will not be published.
Mm.
Most likely. Like, and everyone's like, well, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell did it. And it's like, that is lightning striking.
Right.
Something that is a doorstopper getting published for a debut author, almost impossible.
Right.
And often, if you say it cannot possibly get any shorter, I guarantee you it can. All of
Yeah.
my drafts, I cut at least 20 to 30,000 words from. And sometimes it might mean you need to stop the story earlier in the book and then write a sequel. So I'm even doing this with my book right now. I turned in a 175,000 word draft for the sequel to this book, and it cannot be that long. So my next
Mm,
pass is getting it under 150,000. And the editor's helping me. But like even us, like there are authors, they're the Brandon Sandersons. They're like there are people who's
yeah.
like, yes, you can write door stoppers, but that the majority of them, it's better to come in low on your word count because it's paper costs. That's the thing that people don't understand. They're
Right.
like, well, the story needs to be told in this amount. And I'm like, paper's expensive. And as a
Yeah.
debut author, you are a gamble for the publisher. So the safer the gamble you can make your book, the better.
So, and especially for new authors, you think, well, 25,000 words, how am I going to cut 25,000? And these 25,000 words are important. They came from my soul. How can I
No.
just carve those out? Do you
Yeah.
have any advice? Because this is something that you're actually going through. Like
Yeah.
how do we all hear kill your darlings and
Yes.
take the writer hat off and put the editor hat on,
Yeah.
but it's still painful. Like how do you deal with that? And how do you
Yeah.
stay objective while also valuing your voice and your work?
Yeah. It's a hard one. I think a lot of times, like kill your darlings, it's not just about characters. The point of killing darlings is that you are destroying something you love. And so your
Right.
darling might
Yep.
be a subplot.
Yeah, it's literally in the title. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just word level cuts, which always like there's filler words. I use so many filler words. So I will get thousands of words back cutting filler words, but when you're
Sure.
doing a cut of that magnitude, it is entire characters and it is entire subplots.
Yeah.
The thing that helps me is having what I was calling like a word graveyard, which is where
Mm,
if I love something very much and I just don't want to delete it, I will I will copy paste it and I will put it in my word graveyard so I know it
yeah.
exists. And then I always tell myself, then I can go get it back out of the word graveyard at any moment and put it back in. And I never do. I
Yeah.
never even look at that document again. And I think that tells you a lot where you can love absolutely love a turn of phrase and you'd be like, the book cannot survive without this.
Yeah.
And then, it can, but
Yeah.
it'll always exist there in your word graveyard. And
Right.
you can
And that
recycle things later too.
yeah, and that's a brilliant idea, and I actually do the same thing. Um, and and forever I'd never went back to that, just like you said. But I have a book that I'm working on right now that I actually resurrected an entire chapter out of my word graveyard because it wouldn't work. It just wasn't important for the book I was writing, but I'm writing a new one and I'm like, you know what? If I change the names, this actually fits perfect over here. And it's the passage I've always wanted, and it just fit right in. And so
I love that.
never throw those words away.
Yes.
And sometimes when you're dealing with them, you can't even see what they're actually going to be. But hold on to them because you just never know.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I'm so happy that the words are getting resurrected because there's always
Right.
good stuff in there. Like there's
Yeah.
often it's amazing stuff. That's why it's a darling. That's why it's a
Right.
darling you're killing because it's actually really wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I love this.
That's so awesome. So, the paranormal rom-com,
Yeah.
because that's such an amalgam of so many different, um, things, how did you start conceptualizing, like, how to blend this and this and, you know, in a new way? But
Yeah.
like, do you set out rules, for yourself as you're starting, or are you just thinking, I'm gonna write a rom-com, but it's just gonna have some weird characters? Like what are what's the framework that you set for yourself when you're writing something like that?
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, if you're writing a romance, you absolutely must have a happily ever after. So like
Yeah,
that is the beginning and the end of writing a romance. I'm not the beginning and the end. There's a lot of other stuff in there, but like it has to
sure.
have happily ever and to me it has to have a standalone happily ever after. So each of the three books, it follows one couple with a standalone happily ever after. And then I don't know. I'm not a tremendous plotter.
Yeah.
I do like a 3 act structure, and I generally know like where I'm going and a few moments along the way. But a lot of it is discovery writing, and so to me, it was like discovering Yeah, I really it's hard to say because so much of writing is just instinctive and intuitive and you're doing it.
Right.
So a lot
Right.
of it was just me self-indulgently writing jokes that I thought were funny along the way of generally knowing like the beats of a romance because I've read so many of them that I
Yeah.
instinctively know a lot of what's like we have our meet cute and then there's something that puts them at odds and they get together and then they go and it's this constant like a romance is kind of constantly doing this
Sure.
and then you have a
Sure.
crisis because you have to have the dark moment and then everything's
Right.
okay again. And so just writing in that general flow, but doing it in a fantasy world because I love world building. It's my favorite part. It's one of the things I have to cut the most words from because I go so deep into like the lore of this town and like the legends and everything and just the surroundings. And ultimately it's
Yeah.
like, Sarah, stop talking about this piece of town history from 100 years ago. That's not
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So it's
That
I don't know.
that's so
It
funny.
was
My
me
my
just
friend
playing. Uh-huh.
my friend Doug, who's a fantasy author, said that if he could just world build for other people, he would do that full time. Like if that's something I
Isn't
could
it
get away
fun?
with, yeah, yeah, that's so funny. So so you're very cognizant of the tropes in your
Yes.
genre that you're writing. Like you talked about the ebb and flow of
Mhm.
the romance novel and the things that we come to expect. Um, for a lot of people, when you mention tropes, they're almost dismissive.
They are.
And it's so weird to me because, tropes are the mechanisms that make a story what it is. And
Mhm.
they think because you're writing to tropes that it's just gonna be the same thing, it's just gonna be another Hallmark movie,
Mhm.
and can you talk a little bit about honoring the tropes, eh, honoring what people expect when they come to a particular type of book while also keeping it fresh and, telling a unique story that only Sarah Hawley can tell.
Mhm.
Like, how do you balance those 2 of
Yeah.
meeting reader expectations while also keeping them, kind of on their toes and not knowing what to expect next?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think every genre has tropes. I think romance
Yeah,
gets a bit of a bad reputation because I mean, people like to dismiss romance a lot. It's just a
sure,
thing.
for a lot
And
of
it's easy to
reasons,
see the marketing
and they're
graphics are like,
snobs.
yeah, and it's like
Yeah,
there's only one bed, there's this, and they're like, I don't want this. I only want my like high literature. I only want like my epic fantasy novel. But even your epic fantasy novel has tropes and things because a lot
of
of
course.
moments of shock and surprise in any book are because the author has subverted an expectation, which means
Yes,
you had the expectation to begin with, which means maybe you've seen this story before. So like Game of Thrones, you see like killing Ned Stark, you had an expectation about what the noble hero
right,
goes through. You were expecting his journey to be something and then it was something else. And that was
right.
shocking to people. So every author is playing with the expectations in their genre. I do think things like romance or cozy mystery, you have to be more there are very specific tropes you have to do. So like you
Yeah,
have to have a happy ending. And then a lot of tropes also serve plot purposes. So romance, things like only one bed, like that is serving a purpose to help get characters together. Like I can say that and you're like, "Ooh, there's going to be a moment in which these characters are forced into close proximity and all the feelings that they are have been denying are going to come to the surface." And that's probably what's going to go on. I have read only one bed scenes where you go into that expectation and then nothing happens, and I was like, "Oh, you subverted my trope expectation." So yeah, I think you have to respect your genre and you have to love your genre, and I don't know, embrace it. Like a cozy mystery, it's like there's going to be a murder, but you already like there's probably going to be not going to be a lot of swearing. Like you want the people that are
right.
picking up this book because they want an experience to have that experience while you sort of play around the edges doing interesting things within that experience.
Yeah. You uh, when you're writing a paranormal rom-com or a paranormal romance, how do you balance the paranormal aspects that you're bringing in with maybe what your typical romance readers might expect? Like, is there ever a time where you're like, I'm pushing the boundaries a little too much with vampires and witches and
Yeah.
whatever? is there ever a thought like that, or is this subgenre established enough now that you can just be as weird as you want to?
I think it's established enough you can be as weird
Okay.
as you want to. There's a lot of stuff, especially if you're looking at like self-published and indie
Yeah.
published, like there are a lot of authors taking very big swings. Like Morning Glory Milking Farm. Like if you haven't like look that up, I'm not going to tell you what that's about. But I read it, and so like there's people doing absolutely bananas things out there, and it's kind of amazing. But yeah, no, what the thing I like about fantasy and why I think I would like to stick to writing paranormal and fantasy rom-coms is that you can make the stakes so much bigger, and you can play. So instead of like my office nemesis, where like we fought over access to the copier, you can be like, well, I've been cursed eternally to like murder my one true love, and then he's dedicated to something else, and everyone's got swords, and you're like, that's great. Like no one has swords at the copier, and that's
Right.
that's why I love paranormal and fantasy rom-com, because you can take bigger swings, and then you can change the rules of the world so like it's reversible, where it's like, well, they're
Yeah.
immortal, they'll heal, like it's fine, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very few people have swords at copiers. We can't
Do
say
you?
none.
Do
Well,
you have swords at the
I,
copier?
I'm just saying, I've had some office situations that got a little hairy. That's all I'm gonna say. That's all I'm gonna say. Um, do you feel like that the subgenres are developing to the point that that we can support um, you know, what would be considered fringe ideas at one point? Like it feels like subgenres. It feels like when I was a kid, and if you read fantasy, then we knew exactly what to expect.
Yeah.
That, and we could predict the covers, from the bookstore. It kind of felt like it was one thing. And now
Mhm.
you go to the bookstore and there are, whole shelves around this really seemingly niche subgenre, and it just feels like there's more place now. Is that a fair assessment? Do you feel like that we're becoming more open, and the marketplace has widened for these different kinds of stories?
I think specifically in romance and romantasy, people were always writing these. So one thing you see lists of romantasy roundups, and I often see Kushiel start on there. And so you've got people that were always doing fantasy books with a romantic subplot. Oh my God, who had a sword hanging over their copy machine? Incredible. I have a sword on my wall back
Yeah,
there. That's a sword I have up there. It's
love
got
it.
Christmas ornaments on it. Um, so like people have been always writing these things, but I think specifically in romance, there's been a lot more mainstream acceptance. And a lot of that is happening on social media. And so specifically things like monster romance that, I mean, people were always writing monster romance, and especially in self-pub, like people have
Yeah,
always been taking the big swings. And one nice thing about the marketplace is that it's giving more visibility to the authors doing that. And something can absolutely take off on self-pub, and now you're seeing publishers buying those up and repackaging them. So like Ice Planet
right.
Barbarians got repackaged by Berkeley, which is my publisher. Um, so I think we're definitely in a moment where, specifically in the romance space, there's a whole generation that's not afraid to be like, I read monster smut and it's great. Um, but I don't think it means that those weren't being written before, that there wasn't an audience for it. I think it's just that the tools we have, and specifically with social media, which I have a very fraught relationship with, has opened a lot of doors to what you would consider some of the more fringe or niche or out there things. There's just more discoverability.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Servant of Earth, your
Yes.
new book, it's been out a week now. This compared to your previous three books, definitely feels like a more traditional fantasy.
Mhm.
What was the idea behind this book? What was the kernel where this story grew out of, and what made you want to pivot a little bit to kind of more traditional fantasy?
Yeah, I was trying to remember the kernel of the idea. Like I knew I wanted to write a Fae fantasy because I've always loved the Fae. One of the books I loved as a child was The More Child by Eloise Jarvis McGraw. And I was reading other face stories, and I was like, I just think this is really interesting. Like the mix of the Celtic mythology and these creatures that are sort of tricksters, but can also be very, very dark and brutal in a lot of the myths. So I knew I wanted to write that. And if you're going to write that, I'm like, well, it's going to be like I like having, especially at the beginning of a series, you have a character that is discovering the world alongside the reader. So it's got to be like a young human woman that is going to the fairyland, and then because that's one great way with world building if you have a character that's experiencing it,
Yeah.
because then you don't have to just tell everyone what's going on. The character can look and be like, I wonder what that is. Um, so I knew I wanted to do that, but a lot of my ideas come from I don't know where they come from, the ether. I'll
Yeah.
get an idea in the shower, or I'll have a dream, or a few times now, like 3 different times, I've gotten a book idea because a word popped into my head. And in one case, it was the title of a book. In one case, it was 2 character names, and I was like, "Who are those people?" And in this case, it was the phrase "the Queen of the Nasties." And I was like, I don't know who that is. Like, who is the Queen of the Nasties? I could not tell you where this came from. I remember it was like an afternoon. I was hanging out at my uncle's place. We are having like a family gathering, and I was just wandering around. I heard the Queen of the Nasties. Um, and so I started thinking, well, who are the Nasties? Well, if I'm thinking about the Fae society, there's the light Fae, the dark Fae, the Seelie, the
Hmm.
Unseelie, all of that. So the Nasties are probably some variant of a dark fairy.
Sure.
And I thought, well, who's their queen? Like, what would these beings be like? And so I thought of this half spider woman, where like a up top, beautiful, and down bottom spider. And then I started thinking about the tiers of the society. So if the nasties are the lowest tier of the sort of monstrous beings, what are the other tiers of society? And so very much the plot idea came from the world building aspect, where often it'll come from characters, like who are these characters,
Right.
and what are they doing? But in this case, I just knew I needed a human woman in a fairy world, and then the world came. And once I had the concept for the world, it was a lot easier to slot her in and say, how is she experiencing this world? So yeah, it was a really interesting process, and I wrote it. It was amazing. I wrote it in like a month and a half, and then I
Really.
edited it in a month and a half, and then I like queried, and it was very fast. Objectively speaking, a lot of books don't come out that quickly, but
Yeah.
this one just did. So
Wow.
yeah.
So as you're going through this exploration process of coming up with even what the story is, much
Mhm.
less trying to plan it out. Do you have a note taking process? Like, how do you kind of
Mm,
remember the when you're asking yourself these questions, like, well, who's the queen of the nasties?
yeah.
Like, do you write that out and kind of explore it that way? Like, what is this this spitballing process that you're going through? Like, and how do you document it at all?
I do, but it's chaos. So I
Okay,
have
we
I
enjoy
have
some
like a
chaos.
yeah, I
Yeah.
just me in general, it's just like, it's
Right.
chaos. But I had a little journal that I carried around. It's funny, it was my bullet journal when I was briefly trying to be more organized, and I was
Yeah.
attempting bullet journaling,
Yeah,
and
I've
it
had
it
bouts of
looks
that.
like yeah, like flipping through it, it looks like I lost my mind, because like here we've got
Right.
like all these neat task lists, and like I briefly trying to do the trackers of things like how are you
Mhm.
sleeping? And then all of a sudden there will be a page of like fantasy world building, or like a map. You're like, what
Yeah.
happened to this woman? What happened to this woman while she was doing this?
Right.
Um, and then I have a Google Doc that I paste things. Sometimes it's sentences, sometimes it's quotes from books I've read for research. It's lists of character names, because I hate naming characters.
Mm.
And so it's just this sort of big, awful, unorganized document that's about like 50 pages long. That's just everything I've been copy pasting. In this case, for the last 7 years, because this book is that's how long it took to get on shelves.
Mm.
But yeah, but I'm
Wow.
I'm not organized, and then a lot of it is just up here. Like I have a couple other novel ideas that I feel like they're just cooking in the background. Like
Yeah.
there's a character up there in my head, and there's a world up there in my head. And someday I'll get to them, but it's almost like they sit back there, and then every once in a while an idea will come, and I'm like, ooh, that's gonna fit into that story. But I'm just letting them cook for now.
We love fantasy because we love magic systems, we love magic creatures,
Yes.
different races. How do you start thinking about you one of the first thoughts that you had about this book was the Fae and how
Mhm.
that um like when you're populating your fantasy world, how do you start thinking about the creatures that might live there and how they're going to interact with one another and what
Mhm.
sort of human-like characters you're going to introduce? It like, how do you start thinking about the balance of power and the races of characters that you're going to
Mhm.
employ?
That's interesting because what I do, I don't tend to be very I don't hew exactly to a lot of the myths. I tend to take the kernel and then go away with it somewhere
Yeah,
else. So like I don't have Celia and Uncelia in this book, even if it sort of sprang from that concept.
yeah,
Or in Glimmer Falls, I have demons, but they're more like I'm a Trekkie, so like they're a little bit more like Vulcans in my imagining. And so you sort of come up with little basics. So instead of like heaven and hell, it's like demons are a different species that live on a different plane and they're slightly less emotional than humans. That and I don't know. I just play with elements. So specifically the demons in A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon. I knew I wanted the witch. It's like who should the witch summon that she would be the last person in the world she wants to summon because that's an interesting conflict for a romance. I was like, well, a demon who wants her soul. And that led to the question, well, why do demons want souls? And then I end up being like, well, it's clearly that they don't have magic in their own home plane. And if they don't constantly sort of feed on the magic of others, their entire homeland will die. And then that gives the hero some really good stakes because he has a responsibility to his people to harvest this witch's soul, which she obviously does not want to happen. Um, so yeah, I think a lot of it is being familiar with the mythology and then figuring out who fits into the world as you're creating it, and then using it as
mhm,
a jumping off point. So it's I don't know, it's just like a fun creative process, and a lot of it springs from how characters feel about each other, what they want, and then how does a supernatural creature's wants tie into that. I just taught a character creation workshop at New York Comic Con, and I
okay,
had people do a little exercise, and it was, I can describe it really quickly. It was like making a little table. Imagine a supernatural creature, and then imagine a character. And
mhm,
you have like along this side, you have, the character traits that you think of this person. And then
mhm,
across the top, you have some of the traditional magical features of this thing. So I think in my case, I had a werewolf, and it was like, well, they have a really strong, good sense of smell. And then they're a workaholic. Oh wait, no, that's not a werewolf trait. They have a good sense of smell, like turn into a feral creature at the moon, all of that.
yeah,
Allergic to silver. And then I was thinking about this person who's very fastidious. They're fastidious, they're a workaholic, and like a secret romantic. And then just imagining where those boxes intersect, where the trait of the magical creature will play really interestingly with the character trait. So like secret romantic, I had this werewolf. She's turned into a werewolf, and she's always, she inherited her grandmother's wedding ring, and she's always dreamed of wearing it at her when she gets married. But the wedding
mhm,
ring is silver, and now that she's a werewolf, she can no longer wear it. And you can
mm,
think of all these sort of interesting things at those intersections. So I
right.
find I find like character plays nicely with the world building elements, and the most interesting things are found at that intersection.
Yeah. One thing that I was fascinated by, you listening to you talk a minute ago, you were talking about the demons and and coming up with a reason for their magic,
Hmm.
and that they're pulling, from our world to save their own.
Yeah.
And I love the term that every character is the hero of their own story,
Yes.
whether they're the protagonist or antagonist. That in their mind, they're doing something for their own preservation, or for their own happiness. And while twisted as it may be, they believe that it's for the right reason. You
Hmm.
know, in fantasy, especially, we've had so many um stories with just mustache twirling, good versus evil.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a place for that, because sometimes evil is just evil. Um,
Hmm.
but I think most cases we can we can figure out that evil is motivated by something else. And for me, finding out what that something else is what really makes an antagonist especially really interesting.
Hmm.
Do you think in terms of that, of like finding that motivation, and do you find that that makes for better antagonists, and hopefully sets up for a better story for your protagonist as
Hmm.
well?
No, I think you've absolutely nailed it, everything you just said, because evil doesn't think it's evil.
Right.
Evil might not think it's good. Evil thinks it's justified. And
Yeah.
so you start thinking, and I love a villain. I absolutely love a villain. I love an anti-hero. I like complicated characters because no one is entirely good. And even though like I do have a very evil character in um Servant of Earth, who's like you would not read it and be like there is anything redeemable about this character. But that character isn't like, wow, I suck. That character is like, this is my right. This is my right to entertain myself how I see fit. This is my
Yeah.
right to power. I am the most powerful. I deserve this. And it's a very selfish motivation, but he's not like, wow, I'm such a bad guy. Like, so no, I love that. And I love a villain where I can understand them and what motivates them. And often the villains are my favorite in books and TV series, not just because they tend to have better outfits and they also get the speeches to like chew the scenery. Like, I love that. I loved Littlefinger in Game of Thrones. Absolutely loved him.
Right.
It's like he always had such a good speech, and you're like, I get what you're doing, and I get why you're doing it, and like, it's such a delight to watch.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think every character having that motivator, and it could be motivated from internally, it could be motivated externally, but trying to understand why they think what they're doing is acceptable and justified, I think is fascinating.
Yeah. Tell us about the character of Kenna.
Yeah.
Where did she come from, and what is her motivation? What does she want in this world?
Yeah, so just a quick summary. It's this human woman who grew up in poverty at the edge of this bog. And I love a bog from the
Yeah,
archaeology days.
of course.
Because like there's so many cool things in bogs. They preserve
Yeah.
matter really well. But there's this legend that the fairies are across the bog and they're benevolent and they're wonderful and all of this, and no one's seen them in a while. So like we're not entirely sure about that, but it's also about like religion and myth and what people tell themselves.
Yeah.
And then they have this ritual where they send women across the bog as gifts to the Fae, where they'll live happily ever after. And Kenna is this cynic. She's grown up in poverty. She doesn't have very many people she loves, which is a huge motivator for her. So she's got this one best friend that she loves to the moon and back and would do anything for, because she's had so little of that love in her life. And that friend is chosen. So it's almost like an anti-chosen one story because no one's picked Kenna for anything ever in her entire life. But she's like, I do not trust that my friend will be safe across the bog. So she follows her. And guess what? Her friend is not safe across the bog. The fairies are awful. And Ken is forced to become a servant for one of their houses and help them undertake help her new mistress undertake these trials called the immortality trials. And so Kenna for me is a wonderful character for a world like this because it's a very dark take on the Fae. They're very brutal. They're very sadistic. And you have to have a character who's constantly underestimated and underpowered and is going to find ways to win anyway. And so she's got to be scrappy, she's got to be determined, and she has to have a willingness to go to extreme lengths. And what motivates her is not only desire to like get the heck out of fairyland and like ultimately like she also wants to like kill some of the Fae because they're awful people. So she's like, I want my revenge, I want out, and I want to help the people I love. And so having a character like that is really fun to write because you can put her in all kinds of situations, dangerous
Yeah.
situations. And then she's just got this grit and this resilience. So I love her as a heroine, but I do think she's the heroine that had to exist in this world because you have someone softer or sweeter would not survive at all.
And this will be a trilogy.
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
a trilogy.
And you was it book 2 that you were talking about earlier that came in at 175, but you're trying to trim back?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm editing it right now. So it's due like beginning of December. So that's
Gotcha.
now what I'm doing in all my spare time.
Gotcha. Will book 2 be out about this time next year? Is that the goal?
Yeah, so it should be out next October.
Okay. All right. Great. Servant of Earth available everywhere now. You can grab it in at your local bookstore and go pick up a physical copy or Kindle edition or audiobook. I've not had a chance to listen to the audiobook yet. Have you um, listened to any of it?
I have not. I think I would die of mortification if I listened to someone reading my book out loud. So I have not. I heard her audition. It was amazing. And then I've heard from other people that they love her narration and she does wonderful voices. So I might listen to little bits of it here and there if I can get my hands on it, but I'm too fragile, too fragile to listen to my entire audiobook.
I understand. I understand. Servant of Earth available everywhere now. Sarah, if people are just discovering you and want to
Mhm.
dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, is there a central location on the web that is the best place for them to start in
Yeah.
digging into all the stuff that you do and follow along for news?
Yeah, I would say sarahhawleyauthor.com, and sign
Okay.
up for my newsletter. I don't send that many newsletters. It's really not going to be aggressive. It's like one every 1 to 3 months. And then on social media, I'm most active on Instagram, and that's Ms. Sarah Hawley, MSSarahHHawley. I am on the platform formerly known as Twitter, but I'm not really there. I am on TikTok, but uh, and then I might be on Blue Sky. We're figuring that one out. I've got a Blue Sky profile. I just don't know if I want to like expand the amount of time I'm spending on social media.
Understood. Understood. And Instagram's where all the good vibes are presently.
Yeah,
So
good
yeah.
vibes only.
Yeah, right, right. Sarah, this has been so much fun chatting. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of Servant of Earth.
Yeah.
Go visit your local bookstore, support local books. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put a link in the show notes where you can pick it up from Amazon. Um,
Yeah.
Sarah, so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you. You're a wonderful interviewer, and it was so interesting. Such thoughtful questions. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.